She didn't cry out, she didn't even speak. But the moment Donald Trump reached for Princess Charlotte's arm and pulled her aside inside Buckingham Palace, the room changed. A royal guard moved before anyone else did, his boots slicing through the marble silence as he broke formation, and placed himself directly between the child and the former president. He said just one sentence, 7 words, and every aide in the gallery froze. Because it wasn't just discipline anymore, it was defiance, in red. And when Prince William arrived seconds later, he didn't ask if it had happened. He asked who had spoken first. Now, before we show you exactly what the guard said, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Tap like, hit subscribe, and make sure that bell icon's turned on. Because this isn't a story about a mistake. It's a story about a line you don't cross. The marble corridor didn't echo often. It was one of the few places inside Buckingham Palace where quiet wasn't a rule. It was a design feature. Afternoon light spilled through the tall Georgian windows in pale shafts, streaking across polished stone and tracing the outlines of ancestral portraits that watched silently from the walls. The tour group moved slowly through the East Marble Gallery, their footsteps softened by tradition, their voices hushed by awe rather than command. Princess Charlotte walked near the front. She held a small leather sketchbook against her chest with both hands, a pencil tucked neatly behind her ear. Her school project had assigned her the topic of royal women in history, and instead of choosing the usual textbook figures, Charlotte had asked to see the real portraits, Victoria, Alexandra, the young Queen Elizabeth, in person. A request was made. A private corridor was cleared, and this afternoon became a walking classroom. Beside her walked Miss Dalloway, her teacher, mid-40s, warm-voiced, slightly formal, but patient with Charlotte's curiosity. Every few steps they paused. The girl would sketch something, the arch of a sceptre, the shape of a crown, the edge of a velvet gown, and Miss Dalloway would explain the lineage, the significance, the hidden details. Trailing 6 paces behind, Sergeant Rowan Hale walked in complete silence. His red wool uniform, ceremonial white belt, and towering black bearskin hat made him visually unmistakable, but in presence he was nearly invisible. Not one sound came from his boots. Not one shift of the rifle strap across his shoulder. He had stood ceremonial posts in sandstorms and state dinners, but today his post was simpler: accompany and secure the eastern route of a private educational tour. The royal child was not in danger. The halls were sealed, and this hour had been blocked from all foreign movement, or so the schedule said. Ahead, the gallery turned slightly at a double archway that opened into a portrait chamber. Charlotte paused beneath one of the arches, shading in the folds of Queen Victoria's state robe, completely absorbed. But behind them, down the corridor just vacated by palace staff, a second set of footsteps began to rise in volume. Louder, heavier, more confident, accompanied by voices that did not belong to the household. And Sergeant Hale's eyes, until now level, shifted slightly toward the sound. He did not move, but something had changed. The shift wasn't announced. It arrived with a voice. Magnificent place, really something. Donald Trump's voice cut through the corridor's stillness with the unfiltered volume of someone accustomed to being heard, even in rooms not expecting him. He entered from the west flank, a side route meant for discreet transitions between state meetings and cultural segments. Palace aides had permitted him to briefly observe the heritage wing, assuming the rest of the tour would be completed. It wasn't. He came in flanked by 3 aides, all sharply dressed and slightly uncomfortable, their eyes scanning the space for press, though none were allowed. His pace was casual, almost conversational, as if Buckingham Palace were just another property in a long list of impressive acquisitions. Charlotte looked up briefly but said nothing. She stood near the portrait of Queen Victoria, still finishing a pencil sketch of the crown's angles. Her teacher lowered her voice and took one step closer to the girl, instinctively protective, without needing to say why. Trump's footsteps were heavier than anyone else's had been in that corridor all day, Every impact against the marble rang louder, flattened by the high ceilings. He looked around as he walked, pointing occasionally, his voice bouncing from frame to frame. "You know, the lighting's not great in here. Beautiful floors, though. Can't imagine how long it took to clean all this." Then he noticed Charlotte. At first, he smiled, perhaps mistaking her still posture as part of some educational presentation. But when she shifted slightly, leaning forward to examine the portrait's details, his smile dimmed. He gestured with 2 fingers and said, not quite whispering, "That one's got some of her grandmother's spirit." No one laughed. An aide behind him cleared his throat. Miss Dalloway gently placed a hand on Charlotte's back and murmured, "Just keep drawing, sweetheart." And a few paces back, Sergeant Rowan Hale's eyes narrowed by a fraction. He didn't move, but something in his body registered the new variable. A man had just entered the corridor who did not understand the invisible boundaries of the space he was in, and Hale had spent 20 years learning to feel the exact moment something was about to go wrong. The pencil moved lightly, so light it barely made sound. Charlotte stood with one knee slightly bent, her body angled just enough to balance her sketchbook without touching the walls. She was focused, head tilted, tongue pressed gently against the inside of her cheek, the way she often did when concentrating. The drawing wasn't perfect, but the intention behind it was sincere. Queen Victoria's portrait was large, regal, commanding. Charlotte had captured the crown's silhouette and was working her way down the folds of the robe when she paused. Her teacher leaned in and whispered, "That's the star of the Order of the Garter on her chest. You might want to note that it's important." Charlotte nodded, carefully adding a diamond-like shape where the emblem lay. She took her time. Her posture wasn't rigid, but it wasn't slouched either, just natural for a child who didn't yet perform for history. But behind them, Donald Trump noticed the slight lean in her spine. "Little loose for a princess, isn't it?" he said aloud, half joking, half critical. His voice wasn't cruel, just too loud, too casual. Miss Dalloway straightened but didn't respond. Charlotte didn't even hear it, fully immersed in the lines she was etching. Trump stepped closer. "I mean, back in the day, they'd make you stand like this." He pantomimed posture, raising his chin and squaring his shoulders like a caricature of royal formality. Miss Dalloway attempted to redirect. "She's sketching details from the portrait, sir, for an academic submission." Trump smirked slightly. "Well, I hope posture's part of the grade." That comment did reach Charlotte. She looked up, confused, not hurt, not angry, just unsure what she'd done wrong. Her hand paused mid-line. And a few feet behind, Sergeant Rowan Hale's right boot shifted slightly on the marble, just a centimetre, not enough for anyone to notice. But that single shift meant his body was ready now, ready to respond. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about press. It was about the code he'd been trained to uphold without question. One rule above all, no unauthorized contact. And Hale had seen that look on a child's face before, where confusion precedes fear. It happened in the span of a breath. Charlotte had just finished shading the curve of Queen Victoria's collar when she leaned a little closer, just enough to compare the sketch to the painting, her feet angled inward, her head dipping forward. It was an ordinary movement, a child adjusting her view. But to Trump, standing behind her and watching with a kind of impatient curiosity, it looked wrong, undisciplined, ungraceful, not royal enough for the room. Without hesitation, he stepped closer, too close for palace custom, and reached out with one hand. "Here, stand properly," he said, voice low but firm, as his fingers closed around Charlotte's upper arm. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't violent, but it was contact. Uninvited, unexpected, and entirely out of bounds. He moved her just half a step, barely a shift, but her body jolted with surprise. The sketchbook slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble with a soft slap. Charlotte's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She froze, as if she'd done something wrong. Miss Dalloway gasped so softly it was almost a whisper. Her hand shot forward, instinctively reaching to reclaim Charlotte's arm. But the damage was done. Every person in the hall felt it. An invisible line crossed. Trump didn't seem to realize it. He continued, still holding her arm lightly. Head up, shoulders back. You want to look royal, that's how you do it. His tone was almost instructional, as if correcting posture in a ballroom rehearsal. Charlotte's face reddened, not from pain but from embarrassment. She wasn't used to strangers repositioning her. Not here. Not like this. Her lower lip trembled, not enough to be called fear, but enough to signal something inside her had snapped out of place. And 6 paces behind her, the ceremonial stillness shattered. Sergeant Rowan Hale moved. He didn't lunge, he didn't shout, he didn't even change expression. He simply stepped forward once. One precise, perfect, regulation-breaking step, landing on the marble with a crack like a drum beat. The sound ricocheted through the corridor. Aides turned. Trump looked up sharply. Miss Dalloway's hand paused mid-air. Charlotte flinched at the echo, her arm still trapped in Trump's grip. Hale's voice didn't come yet, but the corridor felt tighter, as if the walls themselves knew something sacred had just been violated. And the guard, for the first time that afternoon, was no longer watching. He was intervening. Sergeant Rowan Hale's step had been clean, not abrupt, not dramatic, just precise. The kind of movement that only those who've been trained for decades can execute without hesitation or wasted energy. But the sound, his boot cracking down on polished marble, was thunder inside the stillness. It was the kind of sound no one expected from a royal guard. Charlotte flinched. Trump turned, half startled. The aides behind him instinctively took a step back. Miss Dalloway covered her mouth with one hand, and Hale kept walking. 3 measured paces carried him from formation to front line until he stood directly between Donald Trump and the princess. His frame, tall and unmoving, eclipsed Charlotte's entirely. There was no aggression in his body, only precision. Posture squared, jaw set, eyes invisible beneath the shadow of the bearskin hat, but his intent unmistakable. Trump blinked. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to inject humour into his confusion. "He's not about to tackle me, is he?" No one laughed. Hale said nothing. Not yet. Charlotte, still too stunned to speak, stepped back instinctively, her feet scraping softly against the marble. Miss Dalloway guided her gently behind Hale's right shoulder, shielding her with the fold of her coat. Trump looked around as if expecting a steward to explain. "I barely touched her," he said. "I was helping." Still Hale didn't speak. He stood like a seal carved from stone. The presence of a soldier, not a servant. A red wall where one hadn't existed moments before. A junior aide whispered, "That's a custodial override stance." Another aide frowned. "They're only trained to do that if the royal minor is—" "I was helping," Trump repeated, now irritated. "She was slouching." Hale's chin lifted a degree, barely perceptible, but it was the final cue. He had assessed everything. He had confirmed the breach. He had waited for the former president to clarify himself, to back away, to reframe the moment with dignity. He hadn't. So Hale, still standing at attention, filled the corridor with the one thing more shocking than his step, his voice. It came like a crack through the palace marble, not loud, not shouted, but sharp enough to silence every breath in the corridor. Sergeant Rowan Hale, Coldstream Guard, ceremonial rank, former Afghanistan rotation, man of strict posture and absolute silence, spoke, and he said only this: "You will salute Her Royal Highness." His voice didn't waver. It didn't tremble. It wasn't loud because it didn't have to be. It echoed the way a bell does in a cathedral, clean, unflinching, ancient. Trump blinked as if the words hadn't registered. He looked around, unsure if the line had been directed at him or someone else. "Excuse me," he said, a half laugh in his voice. "I think we're all a little tense today." But Hale didn't respond. He remained exactly where he stood, between Trump and Charlotte, his body still, but his words still ringing. Charlotte hadn't moved, but her eyes were fixed on Hale now, wide and uncertain. No one had ever defended her like that inside palace walls, not with rules, not with words. Aides exchanged glances. A steward took a cautious step forward before hesitating. Miss Dalloway reached behind Hale's frame and gently touched Charlotte's shoulder. And Trump, he didn't know what to do. "I'm not saluting a kid," he said, trying to smile. "Come on!" Still no movement. The tension in the corridor was no longer political. It wasn't ceremonial. It was personal. Because the moment had stopped being about posture or perception or even protocol. It was now about respect. And Hale, with just 7 words, had redrawn the line, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in defense of a child, one who hadn't asked to be touched or judged or humiliated beneath the gaze of her ancestors' portraits. "You will salute Her Royal Highness." The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was watching. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was stiff, strained, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. And yet Sergeant Hale remained motionless, 1 step out of formation, 1 line delivered. No raised voice, no second warning, just that 1 sentence, still lingering in the gallery's atmosphere like an old flag left flying. Donald Trump scoffed quietly, then turned, more to his aides than the guard. "You believe this guy? What's next? Curtsy lessons?" None of them answered, because they weren't sure what protocol permitted anymore. Not after that line. Not after the guard spoke. One aide whispered to the other, "We need to alert." "Already done," came the reply. They meant Prince William. Miss Dalloway gently guided Charlotte another half-step backward, her arm around the girl's shoulders now. Charlotte didn't resist. Her lips were tight, eyes fixed on Hale, not in fear, but in the way a child watches a tower steady itself in an earthquake. Trump took a breath and tried again. It was a gentle nudge. I moved her. What, half a step? I was helping her stand like a Windsor. The words were louder this time, spoken toward no one in particular, as though volume could rewrite reality. "She didn't look royal. That's all I said." Still no response from the guard, but Charlotte flinched. Just a small movement, shoulders drawing in, fingers tightening around the sketchbook she'd retrieved without anyone noticing. An assistant to the Lord Chamberlain appeared at the edge of the corridor, standing back, not interrupting. 2 more royal stewards moved quietly into the gallery, just inside the nearest arch. Hale didn't shift, didn't explain, didn't escalate, because he didn't need to. His job was never to debate, only to hold the line. And behind that line, Charlotte remained silent, but her hand lifted to her mouth for a moment, covering her lips in the way children do when trying to swallow emotion. One steward pulled out a radio but didn't speak into it, just waited. Because the only person whose authority could rebalance this moment wasn't here yet. But he was coming. And when Prince William entered the hall, he would see everything. The moment cracked open with a door, not slammed, not flung, just opened, swiftly, cleanly, from the western access near the Sovereign's gallery. Prince William's footsteps landed like punctuation. Not rushed, but quick enough to signal urgency. His coat was unbuttoned, flaring slightly as he walked, his pace cutting through the corridor like a scalpel through gauze. He didn't ask where, he didn't look for the source. His eyes locked instantly on his daughter. Charlotte, still silent, still stiff, stood half-shielded behind Miss Dalloway, her fingers clenching the edge of her coat sleeve. Her expression wasn't panicked now, it was smaller, collapsed inward, as if she were trying to disappear behind decorum. William's face didn't change, but the temperature around him did. He walked straight to her, kneeling in one smooth motion, his hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, darling?" he asked softly. Charlotte nodded. Barely. Only then did he rise, and only then did he turn toward the scene behind him. Trump stood with his arms slightly open, caught somewhere between confusion and frustration. "Bit of a misfire," he offered. "She looked like she needed a little posture correction, just a misunderstanding." William didn't answer. His gaze moved past Trump, to the man still standing between them. Sergeant Rowan Hale had not moved since his line. William's eyes met his, and though Hale said nothing, The message was already clear, so William spoke. "What happened?" Trump's tone turned explanatory. "I barely touched her. She was slouching in front of the portrait. I was helping her stand properly, like a royal." William's reply was coldly clipped. "That wasn't your place." There was no anger in his voice, but no warmth either. Just the kind of tone a soldier hears when he's crossed a line and the commanding officer hasn't decided whether to reprimand or remove. Trump chuckled awkwardly, gesturing toward the guard. "Your guy here just told me to salute a kid." William didn't look at him. He turned his head to Hale instead. "Sergeant?" Hale's voice was steady. "Custodial breach. Unauthorized contact." I intervened. William nodded once. Slow. Controlled. And just behind them, the aides had all gone still, because even they could feel it now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a moment, and it belonged unmistakably to the guard and the child he'd stepped forward to defend. There was a kind of stillness that followed William's words, not heavy, but unmistakably final. The kind of stillness that happens when authority doesn't need to raise its voice. Trump's face tightened. "I didn't hurt her," he said, as if clarifying something no one had accused him of. "She was slouched. I nudged her to stand tall. That's how royal girls used to be taught, right? Posture matters." William didn't engage the logic. He simply said, "She is not your pupil." He turned slightly, eyes narrowing. "And this is not a ballroom." Charlotte hadn't moved. Her hands remained in fists at her sides, sketchbook now closed beneath one arm. Her head was slightly bowed, as if trying to process whether the past 2 minutes had really happened. Hale still stood between her and the former president, his frame a red-clad line that had not and would not shift. Trump opened a hand, clearly trying to lighten the tone. "Come on, she's a beautiful kid. Looked a little tired, that's all. I was just reminding her where she comes from." That landed poorly. William's eyes sharpened. "She knows exactly where she comes from." For a brief second, Trump looked genuinely taken aback. Not hurt, not offended. Just surprised that no one in the room had bent with his tone. Behind him, one of his aides whispered something, but he waved it off. Miss Dalloway reached down to adjust Charlotte's coat sleeve, speaking softly. "We'll continue later, if you'd like." Charlotte nodded just once. Then William turned to Hale. "You remained in post?" "Yes, sir." "You raised your voice?" "Yes, sir." "First time on duty?" Hale's response was immediate. "Yes, sir." William didn't praise him, didn't thank him, just looked at him a moment longer, assessing, processing, and something in his expression said more than a commendation ever could. Then he looked to Trump. "You've been given extraordinary access here today," William said. "That does not include correcting royal minors, ever." Trump shifted. "Look, But William had already turned to the steward nearest the arch. "Escort our guest to the White Salon. No further direct interaction." The steward nodded. "Of course, Your Royal Highness." Trump exhaled, shook his head, and followed, not expelled, not scolded, but corrected, in front of the very girl he'd tried to adjust. The door to the White Salon clicked shut behind the departing group. No one announced what had happened. No aide drafted a memo. No steward scribbled down names for the press office. Because this wasn't the kind of incident that required headlines. It required silence and adjustment. Within 15 minutes, the route Charlotte had been walking was quietly locked to all unofficial visitors for the remainder of the day. The royal household staff received a single-line alert in their comms. Section B gallery access paused. Internal review pending. Nothing more. Charlotte sat quietly in a private drawing room, sipping lukewarm tea, while Miss Dalloway reviewed her sketchbook with her. Neither of them mentioned the moment again, not out of fear, just out of reverence for how quickly it had passed and how quietly it had been contained. Prince William remained on the East Wing's lower floor. He did not summon his press team. He did not notify Catherine, not yet. Instead, he requested a handwritten note from the steward log. Custodial override initiated by Coldstream Guard Hale. Reason? Protective protocol engagement. Status? Justified. That was all he needed. And as for Sergeant Rowan Hale, he never left his post. Once Charlotte had been guided away by her teacher, and once Trump had been escorted through the opposite arch, Hale stepped back 2 paces into ceremonial position. No slouch, no sigh, no adrenaline leak. His boot heels clicked gently together. His hands resumed their position at his sides. His shadow returned to stillness. One of the stewards approached him half an hour later, with a folded linen cloth and a cold bottle of water. "You all right, Sergeant?" the man asked quietly. Hale nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Need anything?" "No, sir." "You sure?" Hale allowed himself one breath, then said, "I was only doing my job." The steward paused, studied him, then nodded. He didn't say thank you, didn't say well done. Just left the water beside the pillar and walked away, because in this place, when something has been corrected properly, you don't talk about it, you simply carry on. The corridor was mostly cleared now, the noise had faded, the tension had drained from the air, and the palace had returned to its natural rhythm, the sound of distant footfalls, the quiet rustle of documents in steward hands, the soft glide of velvet ropes being reset. Charlotte re-entered the gallery a short while later. Not because she had to, because she wanted to finish her sketch. Miss Dalloway walked beside her without speaking, her hands gently clasped behind her back. They moved slowly, taking the long way around, passing between archways, now empty of any guests. Charlotte carried her sketchbook tucked beneath one arm again. Her shoulders weren't slumped, but they weren't squared either. There was no trace of ceremony, only the quiet presence of a child who had been publicly embarrassed, then quietly protected. And standing at the far end of the corridor, just where the light bent across the polished stone, was Sergeant Rowan Hale. He was back in full ceremonial posture, shoulders square, bearskin hat, casting a long, dark silhouette, eyes forward, still. Charlotte slowed as they approached. Her hand lingered over the sketchbook's spine, her pencil tucked loosely between 2 fingers. She didn't say anything, didn't break formation, didn't curtsy or bow. She just stopped, lifted her chin, and looked up at him. For a moment she waited, unsure if guards were even allowed to look back, but Hale shifted his gaze, just slightly. His eyes met hers, and then he nodded, barely, once. Charlotte returned it, just as small. No smile, no words, but something settled between them in that instant, a recognition, a promise. Not of protocol, not of history, of trust. She turned without comment, walked the last few feet to Queen Victoria's portrait, and picked up her pencil again. And Hale, he never moved again. Should a royal guard be allowed to break formation when a child is touched without permission, no matter who does it? And was the guard right to demand a salute, would he, or did he take the protocol too far? Let us know what you think in the comments. We read every single one. And if you found this story worth standing for, tap like, hit subscribe, and make sure that bell icon is on so you never miss one of our Royal Guard stories. Share this video with someone who still believes respect matters more than rank. And while you're here, choose one of the videos now appearing on your screen. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with a brand new story.